Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1987. The decade is starting to feel a little bit like it's waning and coming to an end, doesn't it? Maybe a little bit. After the eye of the storm that was 1985 and the whipping winds that was 1986, I feel like now we're just starting to take some of those really great ideas that were jostling together and whipping into these giant cyclones in 86, and they're starting to form actual patterns and structured ideas, which is really exciting stuff. I'm excited for us to talk about 1987 because there's a lot of genres that are just starting to venture out from one another and spread out. So there's a lot to talk about here for sure. Before we get going, though, I just want to remind that if you're interested in listening to any of the tracks that I talk about in today's episode in my Essential albums, you can feel free to check those out in my Essential playlist on Spotify. Or if you're interested in listening to the bigger list that I've made for 1987, in which you can listen to the whole albums for my essentials, listen to my conspicuous absences, or anything that I haven't referenced here but I really liked and kept on my bigger list, you can check that out on Spotify also. They're both linked in the description of today's episode. Okay, what are we talking about today? As usual, music trends. What's moving in? What's moving out? What's hot right now? Essential albums for this year and why. There's not 20 this year, thank goodness, but there's still quite a few of them. And then my conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. So, musical trends. Electronica is still moving in. I don't think that that's a mystery to anybody. When we say electronica in this case, we're talking about IDM, EDM, house. We're more talking about those, I would say, 90s era electronica subgenres. They're still moving in, definitely have a long runway there. Video game music. When we talk about this era of video game music, specifically Nintendo, because Sega hasn't created their game system yet. It hasn't been released yet. So really, we're mostly talking about Nintendo music. Next, the next era of alternative rock, which is the Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr. variety of alternative rock. I don't really have a better definition for it than just the next era, the next iteration of alternative rock. That is on the way in. It hasn't yet supplanted, I would say, the REM style of alternative rock, but we're getting pretty close. And then finally, the post-Paisley rock era of neo-psychedelic rock. So everything that we've been talking about around neo-psychedelic rock for the last 2, 3, 4 years, that is still moving in, but it's not quite on trend just yet. And inevitably, there will be later iterations of neo-psychedelic rock that take place in the mid-late 90s, and we'll talk about those when we start to hear those markers that they're coming in. So what's hot right now? Gangsta Rap is officially moved in. It's on the top of the mountain. It's pushed off the golden age of rap for sure. So it's officially on trend. It's definitely not hit its peak yet, but it's most definitely becoming the standard sound for the rap genre of the moment. Absolutely. Next, the Janet Jackson era of R&B. We talked about Janet Jackson last year with Control. I would say that the sound that she's ushering in, this harder variety of R&B in which there's more than likely heavy punchy synths and also some guitar work, and the lyrics are becoming a little bit more risque than they have been in the past, where it might have been just straight innuendo. That era of R&B is very much on trend and has sort of pushed out the previous era of R&B, which is the post-disco contemporary R&B variety, which we talked about last year in 86. Next, the Def Leppard era of hair metal. I would say that there's probably going to be one more era of hair metal that will go on trend, but right now, this era of hair metal with Def Leppard, Rat, Bon Jovi, that is the standard variety of hair metal right now, so we're going to stick with that for another year or two before something else comes along, I'm sure. Also, as I said, the REM era of alternative rock, their version of alternative rock isn't necessarily as on top of the mountain as it has been. At this point, we've had 3, 4 albums from REM on the essentials list, all of which are tremendous, but eventually, like all creative pursuits, eventually that creativity starts to wane and other ideas start to take it over, like we're saying with the Sonic Youth and Dinosaur Jr. version of alternative rock will start to push the REM version out, but not quite yet. REM is still on top. And then neo-traditionalist country, when we're thinking about, as I said, Dwight Yoakam from last year, Reba McEntire, the Judds, Travis Tritt, Randy Travis, those are all the current era of neo-traditionalist country. It's still on top. I think give it another 2, 3 years. a new variety of neo-traditionalist country, a new era will start for it, and we'll keep track of that as we continue to hear those markers and those essential albums come out. And what's moving out? The golden age of rap. I would say that in 87, if you're exclusively listening to the golden age of rap and not anything else, you're probably missing what's current and hot right now, which is gangsta rap. So because of that, it is starting to move out. It's not passe just yet necessarily, but it's definitely been pushed off the top of the mountain by gangsta rap for sure. And then city pop, I would say it's probably got another year in its current iteration. There's definitely some artists in Japan that are coming out that are reshaping the idea of what J-pop is, like Size, for example, from a few years ago. And they will continue to push the early 80s, late 70s variety of city pop out. As I said several years ago, it's a long runway. I mean, we've been talking about city pop being approximately on trend for about 7 years, which is pretty long. So it's about time. Next, let's talk about my essential albums for this year and why. First, Boogie Down Productions' Criminal Minded. If the album title didn't give you a hint, this is gangsta rap. So Boogie Down Productions, which is KRS-One, fantastic DJ, fantastic rapper and lyricist. It's a tremendous album. The two tracks that I called out specifically, one of which is hyper famous for him, which is 9mm Goes Bang, again, gangster rap, and the other one being Poetry, which is a little less so, but still quite popular because Boogie Down Productions is fundamental for early gangster rap, that early era. I would say, interestingly enough, that this album continues that evolution of not being 100% gangster rap. I would say it's like 20% golden age of rap still and 80% gangster rap, but it's nearly all the way there. There's definitely examples this year that are far more in the direction of being gangster rap than this is, but it's a really good hybrid, 1 foot on one side, 1 foot on the other, even if maybe there's only a couple toes on the golden age side. You can hear where KRS-One's influences come from earlier iterations of rap, for example, house parties and the like. But the topics are criminally focused. They're focused on the things that gangster rap tends to be about, which is really great stuff. So this is early for him. There's more to do here for him in later albums, but as an entry point for Boogie Down Productions and KRS-One, this is a great start for all of you. So check out, again, Poetry, 9mm Goes Bang. Both two great tracks. Next, Def Leppard, Hysteria. Def Leppard's back. Isn't that fun? I'm excited about this. Interestingly enough, what I said about Def Leppard a few years ago about how I wasn't totally into it, going through this podcast and really digging into some of the music that I was putting on my lists as I was originally going through this project. So I did 1987, I would say a year ago at this point. So it's been a minute since I built the initial list for 87, but going through and doing really intensive listening of some of these really great albums, Def Leppard, at least this year with Hysteria, has really emerged for me as a quality product. So whatever I said about Def Leppard and Pyromania in the past, I apologize profusely and endlessly. This album is really great. They've really tightened up everything since Pyromania, specifically the tracks that I call out, Women, Love Bites, and Pour Some Sugar on Me, which is one of their gigantic hits. But I'd like to believe that they learned a lot since Pyromania, because this album is super tight. It reinforces that their version of hair metal is still very much on top and is the standard, and that even though bands like Rat and Bon Jovi have come along, that Def Leppard is still setting a standard here, which is really great stuff. So give those 3 tracks a listen. This album is much more, I would say, accessible and tightened up than Pyromania was. So give more of this a listen if you're really into it. And the thing about Pour Some Sugar on Me, which for those that perhaps grew up in the 80s or are just very familiar with this song out of context for the rest of the album, I would just encourage you as much as you can to turn off your biases and your previous experience with the song and listen to it in the context of some of these other tracks, because you might hear and experience something a little bit different or more nuanced with what they're doing, as opposed to just kind of the straight ahead, yep, it sounds like hair metal, period. That's what I tried to do in this case, and remove as many of my biases and historical understandings as I could. And with Women and Love Bites put together with Pour Some Sugar on Me, it does enhance it in a way and does give you some better context about what they were going for in the moment. And it just comes across really confidently and really competently, which is what we all like to experience and appreciate about great music. So give those 3 tracks a listen. The whole album is really good and kind of like this. So give the whole thing a shot. Next, we talked about them during the trends, but Dinosaur Jr., You're Living All Over Me. It's, I would say, alternative rock, slacker rock, for example. Like, they're fed up with everything and they don't really care too much about how well they play their instruments on purpose. Here's the thing. There's been one or two albums that have come out since 1982 that I can confidently say were official, let's just say, successors to Fang, where Fang and Landshark was so filled with malaise and discontent, like a numbed discontent, that Landshark in that moment was really an album out of time and space, right? Like, it made no sense being in 1982. It was totally innovative. I know that Flipper was around, so like there were other artists that were doing approximately the same thing, and Fang just happened to rise to the top in this case. But finally in 1987, I can declare that somebody has created an album that is certainly of a quality that I'm paying attention to it, but that actually honors in a direct or indirect way the greatness that was Landshark, because Little Fury Things, Sludge Feast, and Just Like Heaven, which is a great cover, by the way, of The Cure, are all through that Fang Landshark. I don't really care about being here. I don't care about being famous. I hate all of this stuff, but I'm just too fed up to care much more than I can. All of that is baked into this tremendous album. And Dinosaur Jr., as I said, they usher in a new era of alternative along with bands like Sonic Youth, where the fed upness is a lot more hopeless than perhaps REM is, and we're going to talk about that a little more when we get to REM, because surprise, it's on the list again too. The thing I really love about this album, beyond what I've said already, is that it does so expertly meld those post-punk elements and the REM style alternative elements into this I don't really care sound. And it's just tremendous. It's a triumph of an album. I love the name of the album. You're Living All Over Me is such an excellent sentiment for this moment. And that idea is embodied so expertly throughout this whole album. It's just really amazing stuff. So check out Little Fury Things and Sludge Feast, two of which are theirs. And then Just Like Heaven is a cover of The Cure. And it'll probably be familiar to you, but they do it in their own style, and it's just really great. It's a tremendous album. One of my favorites from the year. Another one that is one of my favorites for the year, Dump Truck for the Country. To me, this is indie rock. And when I say indie rock, I mean indie rock from the mid-late 90s indie rock. So this is way out in front. This is pre-Flaming Lips, neo-psychedelic indie rock. It's really interesting stuff. And I say pre-Flaming Lips because you'll hear it and go, wow, this sounds like the Flaming Lips. Yes, it does, very much so. I would even venture to guess that this is something akin to like pre-shoegaze, because there is a quiet, contemplative way that some of the tracks are executed. And it's really great stuff. This to me is another one of those albums like we've been talking about over the course of this podcast, where you ask, what is this album doing here? It seems way ahead of where everything else was going, which is to say, if people later in time listened to this and got inspired and took this dump truck sound and turned it into a trend later, maybe it's possible. We can never be totally certain unless we actually interview these artists themselves and ask them direct point blank, was this an influence for you? And then we can confirm it. But either way, you can listen to this. So Island, Brush Me Back, For the Country, all three of those tracks give you a good variety for A, what Dump Truck was doing at the time, but also the possibilities for who they might have been influencing in the future. Like, which artists were listening to those three tracks and getting inspired. I guarantee you there's a laundry list of them, because this stuff is really dense with creativity and fantastic new directions that alternative and indie rock and possibility of later iterations of neo-psychedelic rock can take us. And so just give those three tracks a listen. This one is really great stuff. Again, one of my favorites for the year. Next, Michael Jackson's Bad. It's pop R&B. I would interestingly actually classify it as the iteration of R&B that was ushered in the prior year by Janet Jackson. I think much like Thriller, a lot of us are extraordinarily familiar with many of the tracks on Bad, this being his second monster hit, because Off the Wall was a little bit under the radar, Thriller was huge, Bad was huge, and then Dangerous comes after this, and that's kind of when Michael Jackson starts to wane a little bit. But at least for Bad, this is his official evolution into what I would say is approximately who he was henceforth. I think that maybe he changed his clothes a little bit as he got into Dangerous and so forth, but for the most part, this persona that he's embodying in Bad is approximately who he is for the rest of his musical career. The great things to call out here is that despite the fact that he's probably the most popular artist on the planet right now in this moment in 1987, he's still experimenting very heavily with the creative pursuits that he's been exploring since Thriller, maybe even back when he was with the Jacksons and when he did Off the Wall by himself, about merging R&B elements and rock and roll elements together into a new, harder R&B idea. It's really intriguing stuff. I mean, I think Bad takes it to the furthest extent. He uses a lot more synths than he did previously. I think it's a little bit harder to detect that this is straight ahead R&B compared to his peers, just because of how much experimentation he's engaging with. I also think in a way, I mean, I'm giving him a little bit of credit here, but he must have been reading the room on what was happening with hip hop culture at the moment and doing what he could in order to walk a little bit away from even perhaps the softened persona that he had in Thriller, which wasn't that soft at all, if we're being honest, but going even further into that hardcore territory by creating this persona with Bad. I don't think it's necessarily that calculated, but I do think that he was being thoughtful about where the winds were blowing, and he was going in that direction, which is really excellent stuff. So Bad, the track, The Way You Make Me Feel, Man in the Mirror, and Smooth Criminal. All four of those tracks should be extraordinarily familiar to everybody that's listening. And if not, don't worry. None of this is scary stuff, right? Just because you don't know it as well as other people do, it's no big deal. There's no judgment here. But those four tracks, I would say, are of a high variety. It gives you a really good sense of where his creativity was at in the moment. But this is even saying that there's really great stuff on here that I didn't talk about. Like Speed Demon is one of my favorite tracks that Michael Jackson ever made, period. And I didn't name it here because I think these other four tracks are a little bit more interesting than that. But everybody's got their favorites. So one thing I do want to call out here is Saida Garrett, who did the backtrack for Man in the Mirror. She also helped with I Just Can't Stop Loving You. Saida Garrett is a tremendous talent. She did a track by herself in 1985 called Do You Want It Right Now, which was like a one-off. She's never put out an album that's been regarded highly, so because of that, she always flew under my radar. And I only came to Saida Garrett after Do You Want It Right Now was used for I Want Your Soul by Armand van Helden, because as I've said, I'm a little bit further in my musical journey than 1987, so I only found out about her when I listened to that track, and then I went back and listened to her original, and then I found out that she had helped not only with Man in the Mirror, and also I Can't Stop Loving You, which they did together, and that she's done background vocals for like a ton of people. So in this case, there's not really going to be another opportunity for me to call out the greatness that is Saida Garrett. She's great. I love her. She made one of my favorite songs from the 80s now. And it's always great to call out greatness where it comes, especially because for somebody like her, she can be in the background of other artists who are tremendously popular and she's just helping them out. And perhaps she has not gotten the direct focus and accolades that she deserves. She's a tremendous talent and she's on Bad. So if you want to listen to either Man in the Mirror and hear her do a little bit of those harmony vocals, or go back and listen in my big list to I Can't Stop Loving You, they do that more actively together and it's great stuff. So calling that out. Next, Penelope Houston, Bird Boys. This is alternative rock, definitely, but there's also a lot of punk in here. There's a lot of twee pop and lo-fi. It's almost proto-indie pop. Like, and when I say indie pop, I mean indie pop from the mid-late 90s. And then also there's alt-country elements to it. There's a lot that Penelope's put into this album. There's a lot of ideas here. There's a lot of genre mixing. So Harry Dean and Voices, those are the two tracks that I called out. They definitely give you a flavor for the rest of the album if you like where it's going and you're really into mid-late 90s indie pop, early 2000s indie pop. This should be right in your wheelhouse because it's pretty much in that vein. I'd like to believe that in one way or another, she was tremendously influential on bands like that were taking this sound from a retro perspective and then carrying that forward. Because I could even say to a certain extent that what she's doing in this case sounds a little bit retro, but she's got the punk and the twee pop and the lo-fi elements that keep it a little bit more settled in the 1980s. So it's really cool stuff. It's a little bit of what was, it's a little bit of what's right now, and then also giving you a view on the pop that is to come down the line. So it's really cool stuff. Next, Pet Shop Boys, Actually. This is electronic pop for sure. I would definitely call this pre-house. What Have I Done to Deserve This and It's a Sin? Both of those are really excellent examples of exactly the genres that I'm talking about here. It sounds like electronic pop. It also very much sounds like they're playing with a lot of pre or early house music elements. What Have I Done to Deserve This really sounds like they found something with electronica, taking their electronic ideas, their synth pop ideas, and then putting Dusty Springfield, of all people, in the mix with that track is super interesting, because I think that what a lot of us who are familiar with house come to understand is that there is perhaps a rapping component, there's a DJing component, there's an electronica component, and then usually there's some kind of songstress, like either a soul singer or in this case, a folk country singer that was added in and melded with the electronic components to create a juxtaposition. And it creates a little bit that standard that is to come, which as we get to 88, 89, and 90, you'll start to hear that more and more, where you've got an electronic dance component, and then there's also some diva-esque singing that's on top of it. Interestingly enough, Dusty Springfield was one of the early divas that contributed to the movement of house. It's clear that they have the Cars influence, they have Sparks influence, like that's pretty clear. Based upon the track composition, the influence is there. It's pretty clear. So as I said, What Have I Done to Deserve This and then It's a Sin? Both are two great tracks that give you a really strong sense of what Pet Shop Boys is going for in this case, and also where the electronica / house movement is going. It's really cool stuff, so give that a listen. Next, Pizzicato 5, Couples. It's Shibuya K. That's the genre, and they invented it, essentially. So first of all, you should listen to the tracks and then you'll understand what I'm talking about. So Magical Connection and Summertime, both of which written in katakana, so that's what it is in English. So it's their debut album. When you listen to them and you hear, okay, so this is a little bit of kitsch, it's a little bit of calypso, it's bossa nova, it's that whole idea. There were people in the pop world that were playing with bossa nova a little bit as ideas, but Pizzicato 5 in this case really took it to a whole different level and ushered in this complete and utter movement, as I said, called Shibuya K. K-E-I, not K as in the letter K, Shibuya K. The movement is still around today. It actually doesn't really start to take shape meaningfully for the next, I would say, 5 to 6 years, because it does continue to morph and change, and there's different eras of Shibuya K. But Pizzicato 5 were the ones that basically looked at the existing landscape of J-pop and J-rock and everything else that's happening right now in Japanese popular music and saying, nope, we're going to do this totally retro sounding thing. And I'm not even totally sure that they knew that they were going to usher in this whole entire movement. I mean, it's been around for about 40 years at this point, and it's still going strong without question. And they were the ones that started it. So this is their debut album. It's really cool stuff. As I said, Magical Connection, Summertime. If you're really into the kitschy bossa nova style, then this is for you. I actually really like this kind of stuff because I know that there's a lot of bands that come after Pizzicato 5 that take that sound into further beautiful, wonderful places. But for right now, they're the best, they're the top, they're the standard. So give that a listen. Next, talk about ushering in a movement. Public Enemy. Yo, Bum Rush the Show. It's East Coast gangsta rap, right? Because now that we're getting into gangsta rap, there's going to start to be this unfortunate distinction between East Coast rap and West Coast. So this is East Coast gangsta rap for sure. The 3 tracks that I call out, you're going to get yours. I mean, that's a total classic. My Uzi Weighs a Ton, another huge classic, and then Too Much Posse. My Uzi Weighs a Ton is a really great example of why this is gangster rap. It is just straight ahead talking about nothing but gangster related topics. It's, it's about drugs, it's about jail, it's about general acts of crime, people fighting and killing each other. It's about revenge, it's about who's better, who's more hardcore, me or them. This is it to a T, period. Like, I know that we're not even just quite getting into the thick of gangster rap, but Public Enemy steps out and is like, yep, this is it. This is what we're doing going forward, period. This is what we're doing. Also, credit where credit's due. Chuck D and Flava Flav are fantastic. Chuck D has one of the most distinctive, recognizable rap voices, period. I know that he does sound like a couple people like Kool Moe Dee, which we're going to talk about later. Chuck D, to me, has one of the most recognizable cadences, kind of like Ice Cube. It's an extremely recognizable cadence and sound to his voice. You really don't confuse him with many people. And then Flava Flav, similarly, he's probably one of the most distinctive rap voices that has ever existed. Like, if you're listening to Flava Flav talk or rap or sing, I guess if he decided to do that, you would immediately know that it's him. And also, he's got one of the best personas in all of rap, right? With the gigantic clock. He's the best. And he's just such a kind person. Call out to Flavor Flav being one of the most kind people that has ever existed. In his later era, right? Like in the current moment of 2024, he's one of the kindest people that you could ever possibly meet. So shout out to Flavor Flav also. And then finally, Terminator X, who is their DJ, is one of the best DJs that has ever lived, period, T done. He is one of the best. Some of the stuff that he does, especially on You're Gonna Get Yours and My Uzi Weighs a Ton, it's crazy what he does. He's so good at it. And we're not even totally getting going yet. The last thing that I want to call out about this, which I sort of talked about a little bit with Beastie Boys from a year or two ago, is that the rap battling ideology that existed in Golden Age of Rap has now kind of morphed into not so much like I'm better at rapping than you are, but more so I'm more gangster than you are. And I'm going to tell you about all the different ways that I'm just more hardcore than you. Like I've dealt drugs more than you have. I've killed more people than you have. I have more guns than you have, just whatever. And I disrespect women more than you do. Like whatever it is, the competition that existed at the very beginning of rap has now morphed into this new idea of I'm more of a criminal than you are, or I have more street cred than you do, but in this very particular context. So it's an interesting but unfortunate evolution in the rap battling artifact that is in the rap genre. So go enjoy that. Like I said, you're going to get yours. It's the first track. It's amazing. My Uzi Weighs a Ton and Too Much Posse. Check them all out. Check the whole album out. The whole album's great. Next, this might actually be the last iteration that we see of them, at least for a little bit. REM Document. So it's their version of alternative rock. It's always has been. It always will be. Finest Work song is really tremendous first track. They always hit you with a really good first track, which I really appreciate about REM is they're extraordinarily thoughtful about the song order of their albums because it's so clear that they care about getting the most important, best, punchiest songs out there right out of the gate to give you a sense of where they're at that moment. And then they kind of hit you with all the other greats that come along across the album. So Welcome to the Occupation, I think, comes right after that. Another tremendous track. It's The End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine. That's on this. And then The One I Love, which if for whatever reason you don't know The One I Love when I say it, if you turn it on, you will probably recognize it. And I'm not going to sing it for you because I want people to continue to listen to this podcast. So to me, as I said, this is probably the official wind change for REM. The next era of alternative rock has already begun. And as a result, REM, you can tell, has started to evolve in order to keep trend with where the rest of alternative rock is going. Where I think previously, like at the very beginning with Radio Free Europe, there might have been a little bit of hope. There was probably a bit of anger because REM was coming from the punk era in which the complaints and the concerns had anger thrown into them. And I think that as we've gotten further and further into the dull malaise of giving up the fight and just sort of being frustrated and sad about everything that's happening in the world as a counterculture, that's the direction that we're going here. That the anger is starting to get replaced by sadness. Like the tone of some of these is shifting. Like the emotion that's behind some of these is still irreverent because we're still connected to punk rock to a certain extent because that's where REM ties back from in the way back. But there's a lot more sadness in there and a lot more depression than perhaps there was in the beginning, like I said, with Radio Free Europe. Even the second album that came out after that, there's a lot less anger and a lot more depression, I would say. Which isn't to say that they themselves are necessarily depressed, because I don't really know them personally or directly, but just how the music comes across, it doesn't seem like it's got as much vitriol and fury behind it and more, this is just what the world is and we're sad about it, but we're making our peace with it to a certain extent, even if we don't like it. It's an interesting evolution, and like I said, this might be kind of it for REM for a little while. I'm not totally sure, but they've been on the list like 3-4 times, and they've been tremendous the whole time. But I feel the wind's changing, which is a sad thing because REM is amazing. Next, Sinead O'Connor, Lion and the Cobra. This is her first album. I would also classify this to a certain extent as alternative rock. I think that there's a little bit more going on in here where REM has been really committed to their sound. This is more in the we're highly experimenting, Susie and the Banshees sort of alternative rock idea. Mandinka is a good example. That's a track, that I recommend, just like you said it would be, and then Drink Before the War. All three of those are extraordinarily ambitious tracks in which she's merging the Brit rock that we've been talking about since the Chameleons back in 1983 with the REM style of alternative rock. There's even some pre-grunge elements, which, as I said, she's experimenting a lot more aggressively, which will inevitably lead us to grunge, you know, like bands like Hole. She will be paving the way for Courtney Love to move in eventually and live out the grunge sound in its fullest possible way. One of the things I interestingly want to call out, particularly with the track Mandinka, you can hear the B-52s in there. Can you believe how influential they've been? We keep talking about them over and over and over again, and they keep coming up as influences for these bands, and it's been years since we've talked about an album that they've put out, and yet their influence continues to permeate years and years and years into the future. So you can hear it. It's really great stuff, and clearly shows that Sinead O'Connor, I mean, I think we all know this about her. She is bravely and courageously her own person. She's got kind of that punk counterculture approach to her, but the alternative rock is, I'm angry about it and I'm just fed up with all of this. I'm fed up with it and I'm just going to be passionate about it rather than just straight ahead snide and angry about it, like with punk rock. Sinead O'Connor comes across much more earnestly, which I think we all kind of know about her because of her famous actions that took place not too long in the future from now, but we haven't quite gotten to that level of Sinead O'Connor yet. But she's a tremendous talent. She's an amazing singer. She's an amazing songwriter. Give her a thoughtful listen in case you've never really sat down and listened to her before. Her passion is clear, like nobody's denying that, but also just appreciate how great of a singer she is and how great of a writer she is. It's really great stuff. So give her the time of day for sure. Next, Sonic Youth, Sister. I think that, as I said before with Dinosaur Jr., them and Sonic Youth are ushering in the new era of alternative rock that will eventually take over from REM. And one great example on Sister is Schizophrenia. I think we're actually maybe a year or two away from Daydream Nation, which is like their big album. They've been hitting for the last couple albums already, but that one's like their gigantic one. Like I said, Schizophrenia is a really great track. You can really hear in what they're doing that their version of alternative is starting to open doors towards grunge. Like that jangle, the jangle rock or jangle pop that they've got going on that's a little bit Morrissey-esque is starting to get kind of dirty. It's getting a little grimy and grungy, which eventually is why we call it grunge, because the jangle starts to get some dirt on it and it gets kind of grimy. And because of that, this is a tremendous fundamental album that is one of those critical stepping stones on the way towards eventual grunge, because this iteration of alternative will be the path that gets us there. So give this at least one track a listen. If you like what you're hearing here, give the rest a listen. It all kind of sounds like this. So appreciate the milestone that we've reached here with Sonic Youth for sure, because the next album is going to be the big exploder that's going to blow the roof off of everything that REM's been doing, and we're completely going to change directions at that point. So we're almost there. Next, Suzanne Vega, Solitude Standing. So for those of you that did listen to my interview with Richard Barone, when we talked about the bongos and talked about Drums Along the Hudson, he had mentioned that there was a point in time when he was going solo that he was touring with Suzanne Vega after she had made Luca. And I said, oh yeah, all you had to do was tell me Suzanne Vega Luca, and I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, now you get to join in that understanding too. So Suzanne Vega, for those that aren't familiar, she did Tom's Diner, which you probably know from the remix version that came out in the 90s. This is the original one. She also did Luca, Night Vision, and then Solitude Standing, the track. This is definitely alternative music. It's definitely lo-fi music. This album is, to me, unbelievable. It is one of the unmatched albums in the 1980s period. Just Tom's Diner is tremendous. It's just her, and that's it. It's just her singing, and it's completely and utterly compelling. Night Vision, to me, is another tremendous track where it's minimal instrumentation and it's just her and she's just nailing it. Luca is another great example, and Solitude Standing is another great one. This album to me is full of greatness. I can't say enough superlatives about this album because of how understated it is. Suzanne Vega is tremendously well known for at least Tom's Diner. Give this album a listen, please. It's great. Next, The Bats, Daddy's Highway. This is really fun stuff. So it's jangle pop and indie pop. When we say jangle pop, it's like the Morrissey, the Smiths, jangly guitar ideas, but also it really sounds indie. And by indie, again, I mean like mid-late 90s, early 2000s indie pop. It's another one of those albums where you're like, what is this even doing here? It's a huge influence clearly on that era of indie pop music. Nobody's going to deny that. I mean, you could really hear this stuff and go, yep, Treason, Sir Queen, and North by North all sound like tracks that could have existed by any of the popular indie pop bands in the mid-late 90s. So if you want to enjoy some of the really, really early iterations of people playing with some of these ideas, go check those 3 tracks out. All 3 are really great, and they're tremendously influential. I'm absolutely certain of that. Next, U2, The Joshua Tree. It's, I guess, alternative rock. It's U2 at the end of the day. I mean, it's whatever their version of rock music is, because, they do a little bit of the Celtic thing. They do arena rock, they do album rock, they do alternative rock. They've got a ton of influences, and that basically just summates to U2. The Joshua Tree is the album that probably a lot of fans of this podcast have been waiting for, because, I talked about how War was a conspicuous absence because there just wasn't enough cooked there, and as a result, there was a lot more that they needed to do. The Joshua Tree is everything that needed to be done in order to take them to the great, great heights that we all knew and hoped that they would be able to. Just because there was so much potential in War, Joshua Tree makes good on all of that potential. So, Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and With or Without You are their 3, colossal hits from this album. All 3 are amazing. All 3 have a huge, emotionally vulnerable message behind them, because it's all basically about Bono wrestling with his commitment to Catholicism and religion in his life, being a rock star, and all of that turmoil that he was experiencing elicited all of the lyrics and the emotions that come out of these 3 tracks. They're all amazing. They're beautiful pieces of work. I don't really know much more to say about this because people are generally familiar with U2. They're familiar with the Joshua Tree. Telling them that it sounds a little bit like the Chameleons' influence, where they clearly took some of those Brit rock ideas that came out and evolved since War came out, and they integrated some of that and became a little bit more melodic than they were. They're a little bit less revolutionary than they were previously, because back then it was more about the troubles that were going on in Ireland and Scotland and sort of all over the UK. And this is more of a personal album that has just a lot of deep emotion behind it and a little less kind of rebellion behind it. It's really great contemplative stuff. And so if you haven't listened to Joshua Tree in a while, give it a listen. Listen to the whole thing if you really want to. I mean, those 3 tracks are fundamental, but listen to the whole thing. They're all really great. And finally, Yapos. And their album is Yapos Project, but it's written in katakana and also kanji. So you'll kind of just have to find it when you go into my essential list and then reference it back when you want to go to the rest of the album if that's what you're interested in. We talked about Yapos for a little bit, maybe a minute, last year when I was talking about Juntagawa. So Juntagawa is the lead singer of Yapos. Yapos is her band. The first album from Yapos is on my big list, I think from maybe 84 or 83. That's really great stuff. It wasn't necessarily at this level, so that's why I didn't reference it either as a conspicuous absence or an essential, but this one is really tremendous, especially because it's clear that Juntagawa has found her voice coming out of 1985 with Suki Suki Daisuki. This is definitely in that realm of insanity. I call it avant-garde J-pop. I don't really know how else to call it except that she is so unbelievably sickened by pop culture in Japan, and she's obsessed with being upset about it in a great way. Like, she has every right to be upset with the vile aspects of Japanese pop culture in the 1980s. She has a lot of very valid reasons to be unhappy. 100%. And as we talked about in 1985 with Suki Suki Daisuki, she kind of started by being upset, as I said in that episode, not only with the Japanese pop music and Japanese pop idol situation that was happening, like the culture, but then also generally the overall lack of safety with young women in Japan, period. So it was both things. And this continues that trend of just being completely disgusted with what's happening in the state of Japanese popular culture at the time, and also with cultural response to women, generally speaking. You know, the disrespect, the lack of safety, like none of that stuff is great. And she's calling it out here. Unless you know Japanese, you're not going to get the full effect of it. But Barbara Sexadroid, Kisuo, and then Lolita number 108, which that track, Lolita number 108, can probably give you a good indication of where her head was at when she was writing this stuff and doing the track. All 3 are really excellently, expertly done. The band itself is really merging a lot of excellent synths with guitar work, and her vocals are as distressed and beautiful as they always have been, like in 1985 with her own album, and then this one. It's the same kind of vibe. So if you were off-put by listening to her on that album, it's going to be about the same, but I think you should really at least give some of that a listen, especially Lolita number 108. That one in particular is a killer. and give it a listen, just because, again, it's not scary. The topics are upsetting, and you can probably hear her genuine discontent, not from a punk perspective, but not like a counterculture perspective, but like she's genuinely emotionally upset and angry about what's happening in the world. And the irreverence that's coming through in her voice is clear, even if you can't understand what she's saying. So give at least that track a listen. The other two, I would say, just sort of gives you the creative variety that Yapos is playing with in this album. But the whole rest of it is about like this. So if you like the vibe and you want to keep going with it and get frustrated and angry about the state of female culture and J-pop culture in the mid 1980s, then this is your album. It's really great stuff. I love this album. It is quite challenging, but that shouldn't be a barrier for any of us. And if it really starts to be off-putting to you in a meaningful way, go listen to Pizzicato 5 Couples, and it'll help offset, right? Because that's super chill, super laid back, very lo-fi. So go enjoy that and then maybe come back. So that's my advice. All right, that was my essential albums for this year. Now, as I've promised, there's going to be a video game music check-in. So I would implore you that if this is not something that you're necessarily interested in, do not just skip over this, because none of this stuff is scary, none of it's challenging. And I think you all probably know, if you listen to episode 0, that I have a high bias and knowledge towards video game music. So this isn't necessarily to say, like, don't skip it because this is my favorite thing. Video game music is a love of mine, but it is also fundamental to the landscape of music because it does start to influence non-video game music as we move along here. And I really don't want you to miss anything. Also, from a purely music composition perspective, it is quite astounding what some of these composers and artists have done over time. And I think honoring that and shedding a light on it is critically important. So having said that, one of the things that you'll notice as we go through the video game music arena is that on Spotify, there is a very, very limited amount of availability when it comes to especially early video game soundtracks, unless they were tremendously popular. So some of the stuff you'll see on my list is completely blacked out because I personally might have a copy of it, but Spotify just doesn't happen to. So in some cases, you might have to go to somewhere like YouTube in order to listen to some of these tracks or whole albums if you want to get that vibe. Additionally, where these albums weren't available to me, sometimes I just left them off of my lists entirely, and so we might accidentally miss some stuff, but I'm going to try my hardest to not miss any of the fundamentals as we're moving along here. So as I said, availability is spotty, so you will definitely see that. So as I said last year, Super Mario Brothers came out in 1985. 1986, we had things like The Legend of Zelda and Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior, which were very early, highly popular hits of different genres of video games. They were on Nintendo or the Famicom in Japan. Those are the same video game system. But in this moment, the big players from a music composition perspective, the companies are Capcom, Konami, Square, and Enix. So all 4 of those companies are making the big, exciting music that's happening right now. So Capcom, they're in charge of games like Mega Man or Rockman in Japan. Konami, they're in charge of Castlevania. So if you've ever heard of Castlevania, either the anime that exists or you've heard of the video games. Square, they make Final Fantasy games. If you've never heard of those, there's like 500 million of them. And Enix, they made Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior. So all those games that I just talked about span 2 different varieties of games. So one is platformers, so like Super Mario Brothers, where there's just a character moving along the side of the screen and there's obstacles for you to get through and get around and beat the game. And then Japanese role-playing games, so that's your Final Fantasy, that's Dragon Warrior, and all things like that. I'll call all of those out when they come up. But those 2 varieties of video games, at least for right now, are the 2 major vehicles that are providing opportunities for composers to create a variety of music just because of the nature of how the games are coded and programmed. And so there's just a lot of opportunities for them to create different tracks. So it's inviting the composers to really think about how do they use this stuff. The next piece that I want to talk about is the limitations that video game cartridges have. I think I mentioned that in the 1986 episode. Video game cartridges have a finite amount of space that they have available on them. At that time, they were just like circuit boards that had a certain amount of RAM in them or a certain amount of hard drive space, let's just say. And so composers were afforded a very small portion of space in order to put music on it, in order to just add color and flavor to the games, because they wanted these games to be as marketable as possible. And they also, in some respects, wanted the experience to be as rich as possible. But again, very limited amounts of space. So typically the composers would have to think really hard about, I want to create this soundscape, usually with Casio keyboards that sounds akin to Yellow Magic Orchestra or Mantronix or whatever. And they have to figure out a way in order to break that down into a very, very tiny, highly simplified sound that tries to live out the vision that they had for this particular track. So what I would encourage you to do, especially in these early days when there really isn't a lot of space in some of these cartridges for highly dynamic and complex music, is to think about what they were trying to go for with the layering of the tracks and the different tricks that they play in order to make the songs more rich. One of the last things that I'll point out is that typically for video games, with the exception of one or two hyper-famous people, most of these albums were, in quote, written by a team, but typically they're written by one person, they're performed by one person or maybe two people, and often those people go by pseudonyms. So I will try to do what I can in order to explain the pseudonym and also their real name so that you can find them easily if you're really into it, but that's just another thing to call out. And then finally, one person that I'm going to call out specifically, at least in these early days, is Nobuo Uematsu, who is basically the John Williams of video game music. Like, he's made almost all the Final Fantasy music. He's made lots of music for other Square Enix games. And he is probably the most famous and most successful video game composer of all time. He might even have enough notoriety that your average non-video game listener knows who he is. So he's the man, basically. But there's a lot of really tremendous talent that is totally unsung that we're going to try and appreciate as we go along here. So, huge preamble, of which I apologize. First is Rockman or Mega Man. That game came out in 1987. It's the first one. There's like 15 of them now, but this was the first one. The composer was Manami Matsumae. And one of the great things I want to call out about Manami Matsumae is that there are a lot of women composers, even on the Japanese side, making some of these fundamental video game soundtracks. And a lot of the critiques about video games being a male-dominated industry is so interesting to me because, yes, I definitely agree. But at the same time, there's a lot of female composers that were creating some of the most fundamental, most iconic music for video games that ever has been. And it's really great to be able to call that out when we hear it. So Manami Matsumae did the soundtrack for Mega Man or Rockman 1. The tracks I want to call out specifically are Cut Man Stage, Bomb Man Stage, Elect Man Stage, and the ending. If you really want to understand why so many of them have a similar name, you can go in and learn more about the Mega Man series if you're interested. But basically, for those that don't know, it's like Mario Brothers on steroids, where essentially there's different distinctive stages that exist in the game that provides the composer an opportunity to create totally distinctive soundscapes in each stage from one another. So it's not just like Mario Brothers where it's the same song for most of the game. So there's only like 3 songs. This soundtrack has a dozen songs to it and they all are distinctive and they all have their own personality. So that's why I call it out as a check-in, just because there's a lot going on here. The layering of the synths is really palpable here, that Manami Matsumae really tried to capture as much of her vision as possible in these tracks, and it's really great stuff. And the reason that I call out the ending specifically is that it's a bridge to the beginning of the Mega Man 2 soundtrack, which is going to come out the following year, and that is actually composed by a different composer, but since it's a different composer, he interprets her work in a slightly different way with more ambitious tricks with the synth keyboards. And so being able to hear those lined up with each other should be a real treat, just because you get to hear how even over the course of 1 year, the evolution is happening. Because the thing I'll tell you about video game music evolution is that this period of time that we're experiencing, in which it goes from nothing until hitting its peak, is maybe going to be 15 years. It's going to be really, really fast. So we're going to be able to see some really huge leaps and bounds changing over time. And hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of that once we walk away from the check-ins and go more towards just honoring the essentials as they come up. And then second is the Final Fantasy 1 soundtrack. As I said, Nobuo Uematsu, he was the one that crafted this genius soundtrack. It is by far the most complex video game soundtrack that has ever come out to this moment in time in 1987. So Prelude, Matoya's Cave, the battle theme, and the end theme. You can even compare that up to the Mega Man 1 tracks that I've recommended, and it sounds so orchestral. It sounds so complex. He's clearly crafting a Star Wars soundtrack with where his vision is going. And at this point in 1987, he's got a teeny tiny little piece of the space on the game cartridge for his genius. And obviously, since he keeps creating the soundtracks for Final Fantasy games as the technology gets better, you'll hear inevitably where his genius starts to evolve and also become the fullest extent that it ever was going to be once we get to like PlayStation 2 or 3, where he could just put full-blown orchestral music in it. And now he's totally living out his complete and utter vision. But in these moments, he had to get super creative, at least with these 4 tracks, in order to get his vision out. So enjoy those. Those are really great stuff. All right, let's talk about conspicuous absences. So there's 5 of them. First, George Michael, Faith. Yes, it's wildly famous. Yes, George Michael is a treasure. But the genre blending wasn't as palpable here as Wham was, where, as I said, Wham took like 1,000 million genre ideas and shoved them together, at least in Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. And Careless Whisper had that real boy band vibe to it. This, to me, is great. And let's be honest, it's great for like a solo career step out, but so many of those tracks were just really, really long. They were kind of meandering. And as I said, they're more straight ahead and there's less blending of genres here. So it's just not as complex as the Wham album was, but it's still a great album. It's why it's a conspicuous absence, and I've just not left it off the table entirely. It's great stuff. Go listen to it if you really want to. It's good stuff. But I think that there's been better even from him. Next, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that there's probably a lot of rock fans that were waiting for me to talk about Appetite for Destruction, and it's a conspicuous absence. And I didn't even max out on 20 albums, so I could have put it in there if I wanted to. But the reality is that hair metal to me has progressed beyond whatever this is. And that's even taking into account Sweet Child of Mine, which to me is a tremendous rock anthem that is one of the most iconic hair metal and rock songs there ever was. But I think that the genre has moved forward past them, like Pyromania by Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, Rat. I mean, I think that they were further out there than Axl Rose was. And this is also not diminishing Slash as a guitarist, because Slash is amazing. You know, the whole band is really excellent. Axl Rose's voice is highly distinctive, and as a result, Guns N' Roses is very recognizable. But I just think that they were a little late to the party on their sound. So because of that, conspicuous absence. Next, Jesus and Mary Chain, Darklands. Interestingly enough, I think by them losing their affectation, droning through the wall of sound, it stripped away a lot of what made them awesome. And now it just kind of sounds like a retro sound. So I'm not 100% sure what happened with this album, that they decided to abandon the highly ambitious approach that they took in their previous albums. But yeah, it's a shame. Next, In Excess, Kick. So this is a highly consumable album rock/alternative rock album. I don't think that anybody would disagree with that. Kick is a very popular album with lots of hits on it, but it's not inherently groundbreaking. I mean, it sounds basically like the Rolling Stones with new ideas, which good for them, but it's not innovative. So because of that, I honor that it's a huge hit. I mean, it's a conspicuous absence, but I think that they were resting in some really strong retro ideas that made them highly consumable, because they sound a lot like the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, etc. But, you know, in the interest of us pursuing what's next and what's current, I don't think Kick does that for us. And then finally, Cool Mo D, How You Like Me Now. This might be disappointing or frustrating to a lot of rap fans. And in that regard, I honor the fact that he's saying through most of this album that his style was taken or copied by a lot of other artists. You know, I think if you listen to some of this album, you could say, oh yeah, you know, he kind of sounds like Chuck D, sounds like KRS-One, he sounds like a lot of East Coast rappers that are coming on at the time, which sure, I get that. I honor that. Kool Moe Dee was around before any of these guys, so I totally get that. But having said that, those artists have taken that sound further, taken the ideas further, taken them to the next step. And so that's why those artists are there and he is in the conspicuous absences, because while he is very much entrenched in talking about the past, they're talking about the future, an unfortunate future, right? Because we're talking about gangster rap, but because the future is quite sad, full of difficult struggles. But at the same time, they're talking about something new and different, and he's not. But having said that, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you agree that Kick was overrated, or that the Final Fantasy soundtrack was the best one that there ever was, and every one that came out after that was trash by comparison? What did I miss? There was a lot that happened in 1987. I'd like to believe I've hit most of everything, but I'm sure I missed something. I miss something every year. What did you learn? Did you learn something about video game music? Did you learn something about yapos or Shibuya K that you didn't know about before? Did you learn something about how much I'm sorry that I said anything even remotely critical of Def Leppard because they're actually really great? Maybe. But, if nothing else, we're all learning things and we're going along here as we are trying to figure this stuff out. We're going in curious. Certainly, we all have our opinions, right? Like, I have a pretty strong opinion about Kool Moe Dee in this case. No shade on him, right? Because he's tremendous. He's an iconic talent that is an early icon in the rap genre. So there's nothing negative necessarily to say there. But on the whole, we still have our opinions, we still have our perspectives. But at the same time, we're still asking in our bodies, asking ourselves in our soul, what do we like about this? What don't we like? Why are we scared of something? Why aren't we scared of something? What makes us nervous or doesn't? What do we love and what do we not? Because that's all this project is about. It's about you challenging yourself to ask yourself those fundamental questions. And in service of that, if you want to go and listen to some of this music, go check out my Essential playlist. Go check out the big list. The Essential playlist is pretty long this year, not as long as last year, but pretty long. Make sure to join us again if you want to keep going on this crazy journey with us, through the 80s, through the 90s, and so forth. You want to hear more about video game music and where we inevitably go with alternative rock music and get to grunge, keep joining us. Also, please rate us and comment. Find us on Instagram, Not Scary Just Music Pod. Make sure to subscribe because, hey, we seem to be doing some interviews every once in a while as a surprise, so you should probably subscribe so you know when they are going to show up. Make sure to tell your friends, tell your trees, tell the star that you were named after, tell your contractor, tell your next door neighbor, because at the end of the day, I'd like to believe that all the stuff that we're talking about and we're listening to is bringing us all together closer, asking ourselves as a group, as a community, what music matters to us individually, what matters to us as a collective, if that is even relevant. But we're all doing that together with that same fearless curiosity. So let's keep enjoying it together, because at the end of the day, none of this music, even the video game music, is scary. None of it. It's just music. Thanks for listening.